Hello friends, I am Vinodkumar Ashok Pradhan, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Sadashara Mandlik Mahavidyalaya, Murugud, District Kolhapur, Maharashtra. Friends, in this video, we are going to see which are the characteristics of romantic poetry. So let's start to know the characteristics of romantic poetry in detail. Friends, if you want to contact me, these are the details. Here you can see my mobile number, which is also the WhatsApp number, as well as you can see here my email ID. You can contact me on my email ID pradhanvinod99@yahoo.com. Friends, as we know, romantic poetry extends from 1798 to 1832. These are the books which were produced in this particular period of time. The characteristics of romantic poetry enlisted as break from set rules, interest in country life, presentation of common life, love of liberty and freedom, escape to the Middle Ages, predominance of imagination and emotion, supernaturalism, note of subjectivity, endless variety in romantic poetry, lyricism, and finally, simplicity in style. So let us see these characteristics in detail. The first, break from set rules, means unlike 18th century poetry, the romantic movement was marked and is always marked by a strong reaction and protest against the bondage of rule and custom, which in science and theology, which in science and theology, as well as in literature, generally tend to fetter the free human spirit, says W.J. Long, a renowned critic. Friends, according to this, we may come to know that romantic poets didn't want to be bound with set rules, and for that purpose, through their poetry, we find a magical impression on the readers while we read their poetry. Next is interest in countryside life. So instead of clubs, coffee houses, drawing rooms, and social political life of London, that is town life, romantic poets interested in natural, physical, and spiritual beauty, loneliness, charm in the wild flowers, green fields, chirping birds, for example, Wordsworth. Friends, we know very well that Wordsworth's Daffodils is a wonderful poem, and in that poem, you see that there is the description of romantic atmosphere as flowers are there, greenery is there, the hills are there, then shepherds are there with their herds. In this way, these romantic poets were interested in countryside life than the life in the city. Next characteristic is presentation of common life. The poets were interested in common life. The shepherds, the cottages had intense human sympathy and understanding of the human heart. For example, Wordsworth, Shelley, and Lord Byron. Friends, we know very well that if we want to have some peace of mind, then if we are living in a metropolitan, we do go to the villages to find some peace of mind. In the same way, these romantic poets were interested in countryside life and were always presenting the common life in the village area. Next, love of liberty and freedom. Once again, we come to know here that romantic poets were giving emphasis on liberty and freedom of the individual. The poets rebelled against tyranny and brutality. Poets rebelled against tyranny and brutality by the tyrants and despots over human beings suffering from poverty and inhuman laws. Friends, we here come to know that the romantic poets were in love with freedom, liberty, not only of themselves, but they were also against the tyrants and brutals because they were exploiting the common people. So, common people should also be free from all these tyranny and brutality, was the thought of romantic poets. Next characteristic is escape to the Middle Ages. Escape from the sorrows and sufferings of the time to the middle age of enough beauty and joy as it satisfied their emotional and intellectual sense. So, in the Middle Ages, this kind of freedom and satisfaction was not there. So, the poets wanted some emotional and intellectual sense to get satisfied. And for that purpose, we find an escape to the Middle Ages through their poetry. Dominance of imagination and emotion we find in their poetry. In this poetry, reason and intellect was replaced by imagination, emotion, and passion. Hence, many poets exhibit heightened emotional sensibilities and imaginative flights of genius. So, friends, previously the poems were highly intellectual and highly reasonable, but the romantic poets were always engrossed in their imagination and emotional sensibilities. So, in romantic poetry, we find emotional sensibility and imaginative flights on its heights. So, this is one of the characteristics of romantic poetry. Next is supernaturalism. We find a sense of wonder and mystery imparted by St. Coleridge and Scott. It gave an atmosphere of wonder and mystery, uncanniness, and eerie, mysterious. Eerie means mysteriously frightening feeling in these poetry. So, if you see St. Coleridge's Rime of Ancient Mariner, you will find the description of some scary atmosphere, and this is what is called the supernaturalism. The quality of supernaturalism we find in some romantic poems. Next is note of subjectivity. The poets were giving subjective interpretation of objective realities of life, that is individualistic in outlook. W.J. Long says the Romantic movement was the expression of individual genius rather than of established rules. Here, W.J. Long means that the outlook of these romantic poets was different than that of common people, because we find beauty in nature, but the sight the poets have that the common person doesn't have. So this is the basic difference between the common people and the romantic poets. So romantic poets were observing these minute details of beauty in the lap of nature. Lucas says romantic movement was in expression of id. Friends, id is the concept from psychology. Sigmund Freud has coined this terminology, coined this word, id. So this is the inner personality of a person. So here, romantic movement was in expression of id, means romantic poets were trying to express the inner personality of themselves. Endless variety we find in romantic poetry because the character and moods of different writers were was giving a different outlook to the romantic poetry. When we read Alexander Pope, for instance, we have a general impression of sameness, but in the work of the best romanticists, there is endless variety. To read them is like passing through a new village, meeting a score of different human types and finding in each one something to love or to remember, says W.J. Long. Friends, here W.J. Long means that Alexander Pope's poetry, we find a kind of sameness, typical same poems he has produced. But we find the variety of topics, variety of moods of poets in romantic poetry. W.J. Long says that reading romantic poetry of different poets is like passing through a new village and meeting different human types and finding in each village, that means in each poem, something to love or to remember. So this is a fantastic thought W.J. Long has expressed, and really we find such kind of pleasure and variety when we read the poetry of romantic poets. The second last characteristic of romantic poetry is lyricism. In romantic poetry, lyricism predominates with heroic couplet of classical age in melody and sweetness of tone. Friends, we know very well that classic literature still has a great impression on the minds of readers. In the same way, these romantic poets have taken this quality of classical heroic couplet in their poetry. So, this use of heroic couplet, like classical poetry, we find melody and sweetness of the same classical poetry in the romantic poetry also. Finally, we have last characteristic of romantic poetry, that is simplicity of style. Absolutely. Instead of inflated and artificial mood like the classical poets, romantic poets have a more natural diction and spontaneous way of expressing thoughts. Friends, here we definitely remember William Wordsworth's definition that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected into tranquility. This simply means that when we are tranquil, we have our emotions recollected, and there is an outburst of those feelings when we are alone. And this is what is called poetry. So, in this way, instead of inflated artificial mode, so this inflated images and concepts will not be understood by the common people or common readers. And for that purpose, unlike classical poets, these romantic poets have used a natural diction and spontaneous way of writing poetry. It brought liveliness in their poetry. So, in this way, here we have come to know the major characteristics of romantic poetry in this video. So, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe my channel. Thank you very much.